Hey, it's Bree Johnson, and we're going to do a short tutorial on SI joints. And this one's more about strengthening and supporting your SI joints. Now, especially in yoga, it's really common for a lot of yoga teachers and longtime practitioners to have SI joint issues, which is kind of crazy and the topic of another discussion another day. I'm focusing today on doing a couple supportive strengthening movements for your SI joints, because a lot of issues for people who have SI joints comes from maybe overstretching instead of strengthening and supporting. And that strength and support that your psoas muscle needs, that needs to come from your posterior leg muscles, which is your glutes, hamstrings, calves, the whole back line of your legs want to be strong and supportive so that your SI joints have stability when you want to do everyday things like twisting, turning, lifting something heavy off the ground. So one word of caution for this tutorial is that if you are in an SI joint crisis right now, meaning if your SI joints are not happy, don't do this. This is for when they've settled down. Maybe you've seen your chiropractor or physio, got your pelvis back in alignment. Once you're in the phase of recovery, this is where these exercises will really come in handy. So the first thing that we're going to do is focus on waking up the posterior leg muscles. And a lot of ways to wake up the posterior leg muscles comes from the hip hinge. Not a forward bend, but hip hinge. So we're not worried about getting the head all the way to the floor, but we're going to focus more on the mechanics, so to speak, of actually how to move your pelvis so that you come into a back bend with support, into a forward bend type movement with support. So what you want to do is start with taking your hands onto your pelvis. And I encourage you to actually feel the bones of your pelvis around. Find the bones of your pelvis and see if you can find at the front of the pelvis your ASISs, those two pointy points right at the front. You should be able to find them if you dig around right about here. So get an idea of where those ASISs are. And it's helpful to think about them as your alignment points. So for me, when I think about ASISs, I like to imagine that they're like the headlights of a car. And right now, in a more neutral pelvis, those headlights of the car, the ASISs, are going to be pointing forward. Now, when we come into the hip hinge, think about those ASISs starting to tilt down. And I want you to keep your hands on your pelvis while you're doing this so you can actually feel your pelvis tilting downward, those ASISs pointing down. Don't go too far. Don't come all the way into a forward bend. Come back up again. We're going to do that another time. Here's another point. Shift your hips back. So shift your hips back so that they're over the pelvis is over your heels. You can't see this in the full picture right now with the video, but my weight's not forward. And notice when my weight goes forward that my butt kind of sags down. When my hips shift back over the heels, then the butt goes, yay. Already those muscles are starting to wake up. So start with your hips shifted backwards. ASIS pointing down as you start to hinge. Feeling your pelvis hinging over top of your femur bones. And you're only going to go as far into this hinge as it works for your hamstrings. So as much length as you've got in the hamstrings is as far as you're going to go down in the hip hinge. Let's keep it small, especially if we're dealing with SI joint issues. Really do this in front of the mirror and watch yourself and keep it a smaller movement instead of full forward bend. Okay, so there's your hip hinge. I recommend doing that a few times. Each time you do it, we want to start to feel these posterior leg muscles start to wake up even more. Here's something to think about. If you're somebody with a hypermobile lower back, which might have gotten you into some of your SI joint issues in the first place, those who are hypermobile in the low back are really good at the hip hinge. Meaning, if I give you the cue to shift the hips back, i.e. stick your butt out and start to come into a forward bend, watch me. I have a good ability because I've got the hypermobility in my low back as well. So I've got the ability to really overdo it, which can actually aggravate the SI joints. So as good as this movement is, the SI joints still might get aggravated. So if that's you, if you know you've got that hypermobile low back, you actually want to do a little bit of a tuck. Not a full tuck like this, but an untucking of the exaggeration of that pelvic tilt. So this will be for you to determine and look in the mirror and see, and you will even feel it. So there's a point when I overdo it, stick my butt out, and then when I just add that little bit of a tuck, which still keeps my pelvis in neutral, I feel the ease in my lower back. I don't feel the pain and pressure anymore. The other piece to our hip hinge are the ribs, and this can play into what's maybe causing, again, some of your SI joint issues, is if you have a rib thrust habit, so I'm going to exaggerate that, that can put a lot of strain on these muscles in your back, muscles of the core. So what can be helpful is to invite the ribs to move down. So your ribs are moving more down over your pelvis. You're going to try that one more time in the hip hinge. So keep your ribs down, which will open up the muscles of the back. And you're going to come into the hip hinge, come into that forward bend, feel your pelvis pointing down, or the front of the pelvis moving down, those ASISs. And if here you're still feeling a twinge of sensation in the lower back, double check if you can bring your ribs more in. So I'll exaggerate that, ribs out, ribs in, pelvis tucked a little bit if you need that. Some of us might not need that. Now from the hip hinge position, you're going to bend your knees. Bend your knees quite a bit and then place your hands on your thighs. Now once you've got your knees bent, hands on the thighs, try to straighten the legs. And then do that again. Bend the knees, straighten the legs, and then take one hand to your lower back, to the back of the pelvis. Again, bend your knees, lower down. And now the work here is going to try to move your knees behind you without letting the pelvis lift up. So watch that if that doesn't make sense. So I'm going to keep, my knees are bent, my butt is sticking back behind me. And now with my hands on my thighs, I can keep one hand on my lower back for that proprioceptive awareness. I'm going to try to move my knees back without letting my pelvis rise up, which will be actually a very small movement. But if you're doing it right, you're going to start to feel your hamstrings and your butt waking up. So really play with that sensation. Resist with your pelvis from lifting up and try to gently move your legs back. So you're not even worried about coming into full extension. I don't want your knees fully straight here. Just start to feel as you press your feet into the floor. Whew, I'm feeling it a big time as I talk here at the back of the legs. So this is great. And then come back up. To that hip hinge. That has worked really well for me. I don't know about you guys. We're going to add another piece to that. This is especially good for those of us who are hypermobile and have a hard time connecting into the strength of their hamstrings. So work on that. I hope that makes sense. That one's a little bit tricky to get. So play with it. The key is trying not to let your pelvis lift up. Now we're going to do more of a squat. And this is going to be this like a really small, refined squat. We're not going into a full squat. We're just getting into the squat shape and focusing on strengthening, again, the posterior leg muscles. So place your feet about pelvis width apart. They could go a little bit wider than pelvis width apart. And then you can have your arms forwards for extra stability. And then when you look down, and I know we don't have the full picture of my feet here, but right now I've got my knees over top of my ankles. I recommend doing this in front of a mirror so you can see that for yourself if your knees are over the ankles. And my arms are going to reach forward for counterbalance, and I'm going to stick my butt out. So this is all in good, but if you are that person with that hypermobile lower back, just like the cue in the hip hinge, start to tuck your tailbone just a little bit. Not all the way like this, but just a little bit to ease that mobility, to ease that crunching in the low back. Bring your ribs in, arms forward. Now, you may feel your quadriceps working, but I want you to really start to invite the movement and the work to be back here. So continue to anchor your feet into the floor. Keep your knees over the ankles, shift the hips back, and then slowly lower down. But when you lower down, did you see how little I went? I didn't go all that far. Also, my torso is not going like this. So a lot of us will do this and reach the arms forward. Try to keep your torso upright and let the movement come from the hip joints to wake up the glutes. So good. I hope you're feeling that fabulous work. Again, ribs in. If you're feeling this in your lower back, check to make sure you're not hypermobile and hyper exaggerating that lumbar curve. Tuck it in. Keep shifting the hips back. And then one more breath. And when you come out of this, keep the knees over the ankles so that you use your glutes. Press your heels down into the floor as you use your glutes, your butt muscles, to lift you up. So good. So if you do that every day, a good stabilizing movement for both in this hip hinge movement with the legs extended, hinging, getting that up and down movement along with the squat, that goes a long way. On top of that, notice every day how you stand. Do you have a habit of standing like this or on one side? That's going to help aggravate your SI joints. So I invite you in all of your movements when you're washing your dishes, brushing teeth, standing in line at the grocery store, tune into how you're standing. Am I standing like this? Am I standing on one side? And just invite more stability. So the weight in between both feet, more balance, weight back over the heels, maybe more of a relaxed core, ribs down, and breathing. And just check in as best you can. Also, last thing, if you lean against stuff, you're talking to your friend, blah, 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 just leaning against the wall like this is going to add to your instability for the SI joints. So doing exercises that are going to strengthen the posterior leg muscles, as well as thinking about how you're moving and holding yourself upright, will be your practice. And it'll go a long way in keeping those SI joints supported and stable.